There's an old saying in the West that the deadliest rattler is the one you don't hear, and in the spring of 1875, the town of Silver Creek was about to learn that lesson the hard way. Now, if you're settling in for this tale, make sure you're subscribed to our channel, because tomorrow's story about the ghostwriter of Tombstone is one you won't want to miss. But for now, let me tell you about Sheriff Thomas Lightning Morgan, a man who'd buried his gun belt so deep beneath the weight of family life that most folks had forgotten why they used to whisper his name. Silver Creek wasn't much different from other frontier towns that had sprouted up along the Texas-New Mexico border. A dusty main street, a handful of saloons, the usual mix of honest folk and those just passing through. But it had something most towns would kill for: peace. Real, lasting peace. The kind that lets men leave their doors unlocked at night, and women walk the streets without fear. That peace had a price, though most folks had forgotten what it was. They'd see Sheriff Morgan playing with his young daughter Sarah in the park, or helping his wife Emma tend their small garden, and they'd see nothing but a family man who happened to wear a badge, the kind of lawman who solved problems with words instead of lead, who hadn't drawn his gun in anger for nearly 5 years. "A man gets tired of death," he'd once told his deputy James Cooper, a young man eager to make his mark. Tired of notches on his gun and notches on his soul. Cooper would nod, not really understanding, too young to know that some men choose peace not because they're weak, but because they've seen too much of the alternative. It was Cooper who first spotted the strangers riding in, 3 hard men leading pack mules loaded with mining equipment. They came in just as the afternoon sun was painting the mountains gold, dust from the trail still clinging to their dusters. The leader, a tall man with a shock of white hair and a face like weathered leather, introduced himself as Marcus Wade to anyone who'd listen, said they were prospectors headed up to the Silverhorn Mountains just stopping for supplies. But Cooper noticed things, the way they positioned themselves in the saloon, backs to the wall, eyes always on the door. The way their gun belts rode low and worn, the leather creased from years of quick draws. Most telling was how they asked about the sheriff, casual-like, wondering if he was good with a gun. "Morgan? He's peaceful enough," the bartender had answered. "Haven't seen him draw in years. Spends more time reading to his little girl than practicing with his gun." Wade's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Sounds like my kind of town." What nobody in Silver Creek knew, not yet anyway, was that Marcus Wade and his brothers weren't prospectors at all. They were what remained of the infamous Wade Gang, who'd once terrorized 3 territories before seemingly vanishing 5 years ago. The same 5 years since a mysterious lawman had hunted them across the Badlands, putting 4 of their brothers in the ground before disappearing himself. Now they were back, drawn by rumors of peace and easy pickings. They'd spent weeks choosing their target, learning about the quiet sheriff with the pretty wife and the young daughter, the man who'd forgotten how to fight, or so they thought. But Wade didn't know what old-timers like Doc Wilson could have told him. About the day 6 years ago when a younger Thomas Morgan had faced down the Mason brothers in the streets of El Paso. How he'd put all 3 in the ground before their hands had cleared leather, moving so fast witnesses swore they never saw him draw. They didn't know why he was called Lightning, or why seasoned gunfighters still spoke his name with respect in saloons across the territory. As the sun set over Silver Creek, Sheriff Morgan sat on his porch, his daughter Sarah in his lap as he read her favorite story. His gun belt hung unused by the door, the revolver in it clean but uninspected for months. Emma brought them lemonade, her smile bright in the fading light, unaware of the storm gathering on their horizon. In the saloon, Wade watched the sheriff's house through the window, his cold eyes calculating. "Soft," he muttered to his brothers. 5 years of playing house has made him soft. He didn't notice how the sheriff's eyes, even while focused on his daughter's book, never stopped scanning the street, never stopped watching, never stopped remembering skills that some men never truly forget. The peace of Silver Creek was about to be tested, and its price would soon be paid in full. 5 years passed, and Silver Creek grew from a frontier town into a thriving community. The railroad had finally come through, bringing new opportunities and challenges. But the peace that Thomas Morgan had fought so hard to establish never wavered. built now on foundation stronger than any one man's reputation. On a crisp spring morning, much like the day the Wade gang had first ridden into town, Morgan sat on his porch watching Sarah practice her riding. At 12, she sat her horse with the same quiet confidence her father brought to everything he did. Emma joined him, bringing coffee and the morning mail. "Letter from Jackson Cole," she said, handing him an envelope. "Third one this year." Morgan smiled as he read. Cole had become sheriff of a small Texas town, building quite a reputation for solving problems without violence. "Says he's getting married this summer. Wants us to come to the wedding. The man who came to kill you is inviting us to his wedding." Emma's eyes danced with amusement. My, how times change. Deputy Cooper, now sporting a silver badge of his own as the town's second full sheriff, approached the porch with a newspaper. "Made the Territorial Gazette again, Thomas. They're calling Silver Creek the town that tamed lightning." Morgan chuckled at the headline. "Suppose that's better than some of the dime novel titles they've come up with." Inside the house, his gun belt still hung by the door, the revolver cleaned and loaded but rarely drawn. Next to it hung a framed letter from the territorial governor, commending Silver Creek for going 3 years without a single gunfight, a record in the still wild territories. Sarah rode up to the porch, her face glowing with excitement. "Papa, Mr. Watson says he saw wild horses in Crystal Creek Valley. Can we go see them? Please?" Morgan shared a look with Emma, both remembering another day at Crystal Creek 5 years ago. But the memory had lost its sting, replaced by the peace they'd built since then. "Of course, darling. We'll make a picnic of it." Later that afternoon, as they watched a herd of wild mustangs drink from the creek, Sarah asked the question she'd been saving. "Papa, Billy Parker says his father told him you were the fastest gun alive. That true?" Morgan considered his answer carefully. "Once, it seemed important. Being the fastest, being Lightning Morgan. But you know what I learned, Sarah? Speed isn't what makes a person worthy of respect. It's knowing when not to use it. Is that why you didn't shoot Mr. Cole when he came to fight you?" "Partly, but mostly because I had something better to fight for." He hugged her close. "A future worth protecting. One where my daughter won't have to worry about gunfighters and old legends." As the sun began to set, painting the mountains in familiar shades of gold, the Morgan family rode back toward Silver Creek. From the rise above town, they could see the new church steeple, the bustling main street, and the railroad station where the evening train was just pulling in. "You know," Emma said softly, "when I first married you, I worried your legend would always haunt us, that Lightning Morgan would never let Thomas Morgan rest." Morgan watched Sarah ride ahead, so grown up now, so sure of herself and her place in the world. "Lightning Morgan died the day the Wade gang fell," he replied. "And Thomas Morgan found something better than legend." "And what's that?" "Peace," he said simply. "Real peace, earned not by fear or speed or reputation, but by choosing it every day, by showing others they can choose it too." The evening light caught his badge as they rode down into town, but it wasn't the lightning bolt of legend anymore, just a simple silver star, worn by a man who had learned that the greatest victories are won not with a gun, but with wisdom, patience, and the courage to choose a better way. And that, perhaps, was the greatest legend of all. The story of how Lightning Morgan faced down Jackson Cole without drawing his gun spread through the territories, but not in the way most expected. It wasn't told in saloons with boasts and bravado, but in quieter places, around campfires, in frontier homes, and most notably among lawmen trying to keep peace in troubled towns. "Man's invented a new kind of courage," Marshal Clayton told his deputies after hearing the tale. "Harder kind, too. Any fool can pull a trigger, but facing down a gunfighter with nothing but wisdom, that takes steel in your spine." In Silver Creek, the incident had unexpected effects. Young Deputy Cooper, who had once dreamed of gunfighting glory, began studying law books in his spare time. "Figure. There's more than one way to fight for justice," he explained when Morgan found him poring over territorial statutes late one night. Sarah's school teacher, Miss Henderson, incorporated the event into her lessons about conflict resolution. The children would role-play different ways to handle disagreements, with Sarah often volunteering to play her father's part. "Use your words first," she'd say in a serious imitation of Morgan's quiet tone. "They're harder to take back than bullets." But perhaps the most profound change came in how other towns began to view Silver Creek. It wasn't just seen as a peaceful place anymore, but as a model for a different kind of frontier justice. Town councils from as far as Colorado sent representatives to study how Morgan maintained order without relying on his gun. Emma noticed the change in her husband too. The nightmares that had plagued him since his lightning days, the ones that sometimes made him cry out names of men he'd killed, began to fade. He slept more soundly, smiled more easily, and the shadow of violence that had always lingered in his eyes grew fainter. One evening, as they walked home from a town social, Emma asked him about it. "You could have shot Cole, proved you're still the fastest. Part of you must have wanted to." Morgan was quiet for a moment, watching Sarah skip ahead of them, chasing fireflies in the gathering dusk. "Time was I would have. Not out of want, but habit. Violence becomes a pattern hard to break." He squeezed her hand. "But that day, looking at him, all I saw was myself 20 years ago. Young, angry, thinking reputation meant something. And now?" He gestured at the peaceful street around them, the lit windows of homes, the sound of laughter from the saloon, the distant church bells marking the hour. "Now I know what really matters. Every day without gunfire is a victory. Every problem solved with words instead of bullets makes this place better for Sarah's future." The town itself seemed to absorb this philosophy. When two ranchers came to blows over water rights, the community gathered to help dig a new well that could serve both properties. When a traveling card sharp tried to stir up trouble, the saloon patron simply refused to play with him until he moved on. Doc Wilson, watching it all with his practiced eye, summed it up best. "Most men spend their lives trying to live up to their legends. Morgan's done something rarer. He's made his legend live up to him." Even the territorial governor took notice. In his annual report to Washington, he cited Silver Creek as evidence that the frontier was ready for a more civilized form of law enforcement. "When the most feared gunman in 3 territories chooses to solve problems without violence," he wrote, "it suggests a new chapter in Western justice." As autumn deepened toward winter, Silver Creek's reputation continued to grow, but it wasn't the reputation of Lightning Morganstown anymore. It was known as a place where justice and peace weren't just maintained by a fast gun, but by the commitment of every citizen to something better than violence. And Thomas Morgan, watching his town grow and change, found that letting go of his legend had given him something far more valuable, a legacy worth passing on to his daughter's generation. The first frost of autumn had barely touched Silver Creek when Marshall Clayton's prediction came true. His name was Jackson Cole, a young gunfighter from Texas with 3 notches on his gun and a burning desire to add Lightning Morgan to his reputation. He rode into town at high noon like something out of a dime novel, his silver-plated revolvers gleaming in the sunlight. Morgan was teaching Sarah mathematics at the schoolhouse when Cooper brought him the news. "He's asking for you at the saloon, Sheriff. Says he won't leave until he proves he's faster." Morgan didn't even look up from Sarah's arithmetic book. "Tell Charlie to serve him dinner on the house. Man rides that far, least we can do is feed him." Word of Cole's challenge spread through town quickly, but the reactions weren't what the young gunfighter expected. Instead of fear or excitement, the townspeople went about their business with casual indifference. Parker's bank stayed open, Rebecca's store continued trading, and Doc Wilson kept his afternoon appointments. Cole, increasingly frustrated by the lack of attention, started drinking. By sunset, his silver guns and fancy clothes weren't quite so shiny, and his practiced gunfighter's glare had turned sullen. "Don't understand it," he complained to Charlie, who kept serving him drinks while Cooper watched from the corner. "Man's supposed to be the fastest gun alive. Why won't he face me?" "Maybe," Charlie suggested carefully, "because he's got nothing to prove to you." Just then, Morgan walked into the saloon, Sarah skipping alongside him. They headed to their usual table, where Emma waited with dinner. Cole straightened, his hands moving toward his guns, but Morgan didn't even glance his way. "You can't ignore me forever, Lightning." Cole's voice cracked with wounded pride. "Face me, or I'll tell every saloon from here to Dallas that you're yellow." Morgan buttered a biscuit for Sarah before responding. When he did, his voice carried clearly despite its quietness. "Mr. Cole, my dinner's getting cold, my daughter's waiting for her dessert, and you're making a fool of yourself. Now you've got 3 choices." He finally turned to face the young gunfighter, and something in his eyes made Cole's hands freeze above his fancy revolvers. "You can ride out now, tell any story you like. You can stay, have a decent meal, and leave tomorrow wiser than you came. Or you can draw those pretty guns and destroy everything you hope to become." "Everything I hope to?" Cole's confusion was evident. "You want to be remembered, to matter." Morgan's voice held no judgment, just understanding. "But legends built on violence end in violence. Look at Marcus Wade. 20 years of terror, and all he got was a pine box." Sarah, watching the exchange, suddenly spoke up. "Papa, maybe Mr. Cole would like to join us. Miss Rebecca made extra apple pie today." The simple kindness in the child's voice seemed to hit Cole harder than any bullet. He looked at the family scene before him, the feared gunfighter helping his daughter with her napkin, his wife's calm presence, the peaceful life he'd built, and something cracked in his carefully constructed facade. Cole's hands fell to his sides. "Maybe another time, little lady. Your papa's right about one thing. I should probably ride out now." As Cole mounted up, Morgan followed him outside. "Word of advice, son? Find something worth fighting for besides reputation. Makes the fighting mean something when you have to do it." The young gunfighter nodded slowly. "They say you killed the whole Wade gang in less than 10 minutes. They say a lot of things. Truth is, I protected my home. That's all any man needs to know about me." Cole rode out of Silver Creek that evening, his silver guns not quite so bright, but his mind considerably fuller. Years later, he would become a respected lawman in his own right, often telling the story of the day Lightning Morgan taught him the difference between being a legend and being a man. Word of the Wade gang's demise spread across the territories like wildfire. Within days, riders were coming through Silver Creek just to see the place where Lightning Morgan had emerged from retirement to end the infamous outlaws. Each telling of the story grew more elaborate than the last. In some versions, Morgan had faced down 20 men single-handedly. In others, he'd shot the guns right out of the Wade brothers' hands. But in Silver Creek itself, the changes were subtler and more profound. The townspeople had seen something rare, a legend transformed back into a man who chose peace not from weakness but from wisdom. They watched Morgan return to his quiet ways, reading to Sarah in the park, helping Emma with her garden, settling disputes with words instead of weapons. A week after the shootout, Marshal Clayton rode into town with a dozen deputies, expecting to find a community in turmoil. Instead, he found Silver Creek busier than ever. The bank was repaired, the hotel restored, and business was booming as curious visitors filled the saloons and boarding houses. "Never seen anything like it," Charlie told the marshal as he poured him a drink. "Most towns, after a shooting like that, folks get scared. Here, it's different, like everyone's standing taller." Clayton found Morgan at his office, doing paperwork with Deputy Cooper. The young lawman had changed too, carrying himself with new confidence after his part in the events at Crystal Creek. "Territorial governor sent me," Clayton announced without preamble. "Wants to know if you're interested in a marshal's badge. Pays better, and your reputation would help clean up the border territories." Morgan didn't even look up from his papers. "Got everything I need right here, Marshal." "Figured you'd say that." Clayton smiled. "But there's something else. Every gunslinger and wannabe legend between here and Mexico is going to hear about this. Some of them might come looking to make a name for themselves." Now Morgan did look up, his eyes calm, but carrying that hint of steel that made smarter men step carefully. Let them come. They'll find the same thing the Wades did, a town that stands together and a sheriff who's happy to let them ride on by, long as they ride peaceful. At the schoolhouse, Sarah was discovering that being Lightning Morgan's daughter carried its own challenges. Some children asked endless questions about her father's gunfighting days. Others, whose parents remembered darker times, kept their distance. But Sarah had inherited her father's quiet strength. During recess, she found Billy Parker, the bank manager's son, being bullied by older boys. They'd been taunting him about how his father had needed saving. "My papa says real courage isn't about who saves who," Sarah told them, her voice carrying that same quiet authority as her father's. "It's about standing up for what's right, even when you're scared." The bullies, perhaps remembering whose daughter she was, decided to find other entertainment. Emma, meanwhile, had her own adjustments to make. More than once, she caught Thomas standing on their porch late at night, watching the street with that focused gaze she remembered from their early days together. "Do you miss it?" she asked him one evening. "The excitement, the reputation?" Morgan drew her close. "Only thing I ever missed was you and Sarah. Those years I spent hunting men like the Wades. Everything else was just a long road leading me here." But it was Doc Wilson who perhaps best understood the change in Silver Creek. "Town's got two kinds of peace now," he explained to Cooper over coffee. "The kind that comes from having a man like Morgan as sheriff, sure. But more important is the kind that comes from knowing what we're capable of, standing together, facing down evil, choosing right over fear." The old doctor glanced out his window, watching Morgan help Sarah onto her pony for her riding lesson. "Man spends his whole life building a legend," Wilson mused, "only to find his greatest achievement is walking away from it. That's the real story here, son. Not how many men he killed, but how many lives he saved by choosing to be just a man, not a legend." As autumn approached, Silver Creek settled into a new normal. But it was a peace built on strength now, not just habit. And Thomas Morgan, no longer haunted by his lightning days, found that true peace wasn't about burying the past. It was about building a future worth protecting. Time seemed to slow as Marcus Wade charged the teller's cage, his guns roaring, bullets splintering wood and shattering glass. Morgan moved like his namesake, a single fluid motion that brought him up and over the wooden barrier. His first shot struck Marcus's right hand, sending one gun spinning away. The second caught the outlaw's left shoulder, causing the other weapon to fire harmlessly into the floor. But Marcus Wade hadn't survived 20 years of violence by being easy to kill. Even wounded, he managed to draw a hidden derringer from his boot. The small gun barked once, the bullet grazing Morgan's temple, leaving a trail of fire across his skin. "Die!" Marcus screamed, bringing the derringer around for a killing shot. "Just die!" Morgan's third bullet took him in the chest. Marcus staggered but remained standing, his eyes wide with disbelief. "How?" he gasped. "How are you so damn fast?" "Practice," Morgan replied softly, and his final shot ended, the legacy of the Wade gang forever. In the sudden silence that followed, Morgan became aware of movement outside. Deputy Cooper was coming down from the church tower. Doc Wilson and Charlie emerged from the church basement. And there, at the end of the street, stood Bill Watson with Emma and Sarah in his wagon, having come to town despite Morgan's orders to stay away. Sarah broke free from her mother's grip and ran toward her father. Morgan quickly holstered his gun and knelt to catch her, holding her tight as Emma approached more slowly, her eyes taking in the scene of carnage. "Papa," Sarah whispered against his chest. "Are you still Lightning Morgan?" Morgan looked at his wife over their daughter's head. Emma's eyes were filled with understanding and love, despite the violence he'd brought back into their lives. "No, sweetheart," he replied. "Just your papa. Again." Doc Wilson was checking the bodies, more out of professional habit than necessity. 5 dead here, he reported grimly. 2 more in the hotel, 1 on the boardwalk. That's not counting the 2 Cooper and Watson caught at Crystal Creek. "Send telegrams to the territorial marshal," Morgan instructed Cooper. "Let them know the Wade gang is finished. All of them." The young deputy nodded, but his eyes were full of questions. "Sheriff, what you did, the speed of it, I've never seen anything like it." and hopefully you never will again," Morgan replied, still holding his daughter. Emma touched the bloody graze on his temple gently. "Let Doc tend to that, Thomas. Sarah and I will wait at his office." As Wilson cleaned and bandaged the wound, the old doctor's hands were steady, despite the day's excitement. "You know," he said quietly, "some folks might start treating you differently now. Man, with your reputation, your history." "Let them," Morgan replied. "Long as they understand one thing, I didn't do this because I wanted to. Did it because sometimes peace has to be defended." By sunset, Silver Creek was beginning to return to normal. The bodies had been removed, the blood washed away by the last of the rain. Cooper organized volunteers to repair the damage to the bank and hotel. Parker and his daughter returned from the church, the banker's gratitude evident in his eyes. But something had changed in the town, subtle but significant. The people looked at their sheriff differently now, not with fear, but with a deeper respect. They understood that the peace they'd enjoyed for 5 years hadn't come cheap, and the man who'd given it to them had paid its price in full. That evening, Morgan sat on his porch, Sarah asleep in his lap, Emma's hand in his. The gun belt hung by the door again, ready if needed but no longer calling to him. The legend of Lightning Morgan would grow even larger after this day, but Thomas Morgan, husband, father, sheriff, had found something better than legends. He had found his peace again, and this time he knew exactly what it was worth. The first man through the bank's door died before his boots crossed the threshold, Morgan's bullet finding his heart with surgical precision. The second managed to fire twice, wood splintering around the teller's cage, before a return shot silenced him forever. Marcus and his last gunman pulled back, seeking cover behind the heavy doorframe. "2 brothers, Morgan." Marcus's voice shook with rage. "2 brothers in less than 10 minutes. Our father raised us 6 boys, and you've killed 5 of them now." "Your father raised killers," Morgan replied calmly, reloading his revolver. "Men who murdered families, burned homes, destroyed lives. What did you expect would happen?" Thunder crashed overhead as Marcus laughed bitterly. "What did we expect? We expected to be kings, to rule the territories through fear. Instead, we've been running for 5 years, hiding like rats because of you." Through the bank's windows, Morgan caught movement. Shapes in the rain, crossing the street behind the cover of wagons. Marcus was trying to flank him. But something else caught his attention too. A flicker of lamplight from the church tower. Deputy Cooper had disobeyed orders. Come back to town. The young lawman was in position with his rifle waiting for a clear shot. Morgan needed to keep Marcus talking, keep him focused forward. "You want to know the real reason I hunted you, Marcus? It wasn't the law. It wasn't even justice." "Oh? Do tell, Lightning. Share your wisdom before we kill you." "In Dodge City, after the fire, I found a diary in the ruins. Belonged to Mary Camden, the rancher's daughter. 14 years old. Wrote about how your brothers visited their farm. How they threatened her father, demanded protection money. Last entry was her hiding in the barn, listening to her parents die. Marcus's remaining gunman used the conversation as cover to edge toward the bank's side window. Cooper's rifle cracked once from the church tower, and the man fell dead in the mud. "Damn you!" Marcus fired blindly through the doorway. "We're not the only ones with blood on our hands, Morgan. You've killed more men than all of us combined. Difference is, Marcus, I can still look in the mirror, still look my daughter in the eye, because every man I killed had a choice. They chose violence. I just showed them its natural conclusion." The rain was easing now, the storm moving east. In its wake came an eerie silence, broken only by the drip of water from eaves and the occasional distant rumble of thunder. "Your daughter." Marcus's voice had changed, becoming calculating. "Sweet little Sarah, isn't it? Playing at the Watson Ranch right now, thinking she's safe. But what if I told you I sent men there hours ago? What if they're just waiting for my signal?" Morgan's blood ran cold, but his voice remained steady. "Then I'd tell you about the Apache scouts who owe me favors. The ones who've been shadowing your men since they arrived in town. Your boys try anything at the Watson Ranch. They'll never know what hit them. It was a bluff, but Morgan knew Marcus's type. Men who rule by fear always expect others to do the same. The subtle shift in Marcus's breathing told him the bluff had worked. It ends here, Marcus, Morgan continued. One way or another. You've got no men left, no leverage, no cards to play. Surrender now. I'll let a judge decide your fate. Keep pushing, and I'll send you to meet your brothers. Marcus Wade's response was a war cry of pure hatred. He burst through the doorway, guns blazing in both hands, charging straight at the teller's cage where he knew Morgan was hiding. It was exactly what Morgan had been waiting for. The next 3 seconds would become legend in Silver Creek, a demonstration of speed and accuracy that would be talked about for generations. But for Thomas Morgan, it was simply the inevitable result of a choice. Marcus Wade's choice, and its final fatal consequence. Rain drummed against the boardwalk as Morgan pressed himself against the hotel's outer wall, mind racing through possibilities. Inside the bank, he could hear Seth Wade's increasingly unstable rants mixing with the terrified whimpers of young Sarah Parker. Behind him in the hotel, Marcus and his remaining men had gone ominously quiet. You remember Dodge City, Lightning? Seth's voice carried through the rain. Remember how our brothers screamed when you set that barn on fire? Burned them alive, you did. His voice cracked with hysteria. Well, maybe we should see how Banker Parker and his girl like the taste of flames. Morgan's jaw tightened. The Wade brothers had always twisted the truth to suit their needs. In Dodge City, it had been their gang that set the fire trying to smoke him out. Their own brothers had been caught in the blaze when the wind shifted. Morgan! Marcus called from the hotel. Way I see it, you've got yourself a problem. Can't save everyone, can you? Come through that door, my boys will cut you down. Try for the bank. Seth will kill those fine folks inside. A familiar voice whispered from the alley beside the hotel. Sheriff? It was Charlie, the bartender. Morgan had told him to flee, but the man had found his courage instead. There's a trap door in the bank's floor. Old escape route from the Indian raids, leads to a tunnel that comes up behind the teller's cage. Morgan's eyes narrowed. How many know about it? Just Parker and me. Used it to move gold shipments sometimes, keep it secret from bandits. A plan began forming in Morgan's mind. Charlie, I need you to get to Doc Wilson, tell him to have his surgery ready. Then both of you get to the church basement and stay there. But what are you... Just do it, Charlie, and thank you. In the bank, Seth's paranoia was reaching fever pitch. Every shadow made him twitch, every creak of the floorboard sparked another round of threats. He had Parker and his daughter tied to chairs now, facing the door. Come on, Lightning. Show yourself. Or maybe I start sending them to meet your maker, one piece at a time. Morgan's voice drifted through the rain, calm and deadly. Tell me something, Seth. Your brothers ever mention why they called me Lightning? Because you're fast, Seth spat. Fastest gun anybody ever saw. No. Morgan's voice seemed to come from a different direction now. It's because no one ever sees the strike coming. They just hear the thunder afterward. In the hotel, Marcus felt his spine tingle. Something in Morgan's tone set off warning bells. Watch every window, he hissed to his men. Every door. He's up to something. The rain intensified, becoming a solid sheet of water that reduced visibility to mere feet. Thunder crashed overhead, making the buildings shake. Sarah Parker screamed at the sound, and Seth's nerves finally snapped. That's it, he shouted. Time's up, Lightning. Say goodbye to... The floor beneath Seth's feet suddenly burst upward, splintering as Morgan erupted from the hidden trapdoor like an avenging angel. His first shot took Seth's gun hand, sending the weapon spinning away. The second caught the outlaw in the shoulder as he stumbled backward, trying to draw a second gun. My turn, Morgan said softly, and his third shot ended the threat of Seth Wade forever. Marcus heard his brother's final cry and knew what it meant. Kill him, he screamed to his remaining men. Kill him now. They charged toward the bank, guns blazing. but Morgan had already untied Parker and his daughter, guiding them toward the tunnel entrance. "Get to Doc Wilson at the church," he instructed. "Don't stop for anything." As the Parkers disappeared into the tunnel, Morgan took up position behind the teller's cage. Marcus Wade and his last 3 men were about to learn why cornering Lightning Morgan was like trying to bottle a storm. Outside, the rain continued to fall, nature's own funeral dirge for the violence yet to come. Thunder rolled across Silver Creek, deep and long, just as Doc Wilson straightened up with Morgan's gun belt. In that instant, several things happened almost simultaneously. Morgan's hand moved with impossible speed to his ankle, while his other hand pushed Wilson toward the saloon's doorway. The old doctor glimpsed something that would haunt him forever. The look in Morgan's eyes as 5 years of peace fell away like a shed snake skin. The first gunshot came from the hotel window, the bullet kicking up dust where Morgan had stood a split second before. But he was already moving, his hidden gun seeming to materialize in his hand as he rolled behind a water trough. 2 more shots rang out, splintering wood above his head. "Seth!" Marcus Wade's voice carried over the gunfire. "Kill Parker." In the bank, Seth Wade turned toward his hostage, gun raised. But the momentary distraction of the shooting had caused him to loosen his grip on the bank manager. Parker, showing unexpected courage, drove his elbow back into Seth's stomach and dove behind a desk. Morgan heard the commotion from the bank and made his decision. He came up from behind the water trough moving like his namesake, pure lightning. 2 of Marcus's men in the hotel window never even got their shots off before Morgan's bullets found them. Their bodies crashed back into the room as Marcus cursed. "Keep him pinned down," Marcus ordered his remaining men. "Luke, get over to the bank." "Help Seth." Luke Wade burst from the hotel's side door, running toward the bank. Morgan's gun tracked him, but another burst of gunfire from the hotel forced him back into cover. Luke made it to the bank's entrance, disappearing inside. A scream from within the bank was cut short by a gunshot. Morgan's jaw clenched, wondering if Parker had survived. He needed to end this fast before more innocent people died. "That's 1 dead banker, Lightning," Seth's voice called out. "How many more folks you willing to sacrifice for your pride?" Morgan's response was action, not words. He drew the hidden derringer with his left hand while keeping his revolver ready in his right. In one fluid motion, he threw his hat high into the air. Predictably, 2 of Marcus's men shot at it, giving away their positions in the hotel's upper windows. What happened next became the stuff of legend in Silver Creek. Morgan came out of cover like a force of nature, both guns blazing. His first shot took down the man on the left, the second dropped the one on the right. Without breaking stride, he sent 2 more bullets into the hotel doorway, forcing Marcus to dive back inside. Luke Wade, hearing the commotion, stepped back to the bank's entrance to see what was happening. It was the last mistake he'd ever make. Morgan's derringer barked once, and Luke fell face first onto the boardwalk. "Luke!" Marcus's anguished cry mixed with more thunder from the approaching storm. "Seth, he killed Luke." Inside the bank, Seth Wade's control was cracking. He fired blindly through the window, his shots going wild. "I'll kill everyone in here," he screamed. "Every last one." Morgan had reached the cover of the hotel's front porch, reloading his revolver with practiced speed. He could hear movement inside, Marcus gathering his remaining men for a desperate stand. But it was Seth in the bank that worried him most. Unstable men were the most dangerous kind. A woman's scream suddenly pierced the air from the direction of the bank, followed by a child's cry. Sarah Parker, the banker's 12-year-old daughter, must have been hiding in the bank vault all along. "One big happy family reunion, Lightning." Seth's voice had taken on a maniacal edge. "Just like what you did to our brothers, come on in and watch while I send these fine folks to meet them." The storm finally broke over Silver Creek, fat raindrops mixing with blood on the dusty street. Morgan checked his ammunition and took a deep breath. The real killing was about to begin, and God help anyone who stood between Lightning Morgan and his target. Silver Creek's main street was eerily quiet as Morgan rode in, the setting sun casting long shadows between the buildings. He noticed the subtle signs immediately: shuttered windows, doors quickly closing, people hurrying inside. The town could sense the coming violence like animals before a storm. The saloon stood empty except for Charlie the bartender, nervously polishing the same glass over and over. "Sheriff," he stammered. "The Wade brothers. They took Doc Wilson to the hotel. Said anyone tries to interfere, they'll kill him." Morgan nodded slowly, reading the rest in Charlie's frightened eyes. "How many men total?" 8, maybe 10. 2 rode in from the east about an hour ago. They're all at the hotel except—" Charlie swallowed hard. "Except Seth Wade. He's across the street in the bank with Mr. Parker." Morgan's eyes hardened. Parker was the bank manager, a widower raising 2 young boys. "Get out of town, Charlie. Take the back roads to the Watson Ranch. Tell my deputy to stay put. Protect my family." As Charlie slipped out the back door, Morgan moved to the saloon window. The hotel stood at the far end of the street, its windows dark except for one on the second floor. He could make out shapes moving inside, armed men positioned for a fight. Seth Wade's voice suddenly boomed from the bank. "Come on out, Lightning! Marcus wants to talk terms." "Terms?" Morgan called back, his quiet voice somehow carrying clearly down the street. "Last time we met, your brothers didn't want to talk." "Things change." Marcus Wade's voice came from the hotel's front door. He stepped out onto the porch, keeping Doc Wilson in front of him as a shield. "5 years ago, you were just some lawman with a fast gun. Now you've got a pretty wife, a sweet little girl. Changes how a man thinks." Morgan's hand didn't move toward his gun, but everyone watching felt the sudden tension in the air. "Let Wilson go, Marcus. This is between us." "Between us?" Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "It's between you and every member of my family you put in the ground. 4 brothers, Morgan. 4 graves you dug." "They made their choice," Morgan replied softly. "Just like you're making yours." In the bank, Seth Wade pressed his gun against Parker's head. "Enough talk. Show yourself, Morgan, nice and slow, or Parker's boys become orphans." Morgan stepped out onto the street, his movements deliberate. The setting sun cast his shadow long against the dust. To those watching, he seemed different somehow. Gone was the quiet family man, replaced by something deadlier. "Your gun belt," Marcus called. "Drop it." Morgan slowly unbuckled his gun belt, letting it fall. What the Wade brothers didn't know about was the gun still strapped to his ankle, or the Derringer hidden beneath his vest. Gifts from Emma, who understood that peace sometimes needed insurance. "Now, we're going to have us a family reunion," Marcus continued. "Your wife and girl are probably at the Watson Ranch. My men will bring them here, nice and gentle-like, long as you behave." Morgan's voice, when he replied, made even hardened gunmen shiver. "Marcus, 5 years ago, I hunted your brothers because they broke the law, but if you bring my family into this—" He let the threat hang in the air. "You're not in a position to make threats, Lightning." Marcus pushed Doc Wilson forward. "Get his gun belt, old man." Wilson moved slowly toward Morgan, his aged hands trembling. As he bent to retrieve the belt, he whispered urgently, "Thomas, they plan to kill everyone. The whole town. Make an example." Morgan gave the slightest nod. In that moment, lightning flashed in the distance, promising a storm. And Thomas, Lightning Morgan, began counting heartbeats, waiting for the thunder that would cover his first move. Luke Wade found Doc Wilson still in the sheriff's office, papers spread across Morgan's desk. The old man looked up as the door creaked open, his weathered face paling at the sight of the gunman. Luke's hand rested casually on his holstered revolver, but his eyes were anything but casual. "Doing some light reading, Doc?" Luke's voice carried a hint of menace that had made braver men tremble. Wilson straightened slowly, his arthritic hands carefully gathering the papers. "Just leaving some medical records for the sheriff," he lied, trying to hide the crucial telegram beneath routine documents. "Town doctor's business." "Funny thing about doctors," Luke said, moving closer. "They know all sorts of secrets, things people tell them when they're hurting, things they see when they're patching up old wounds." His eyes narrowed. Like bullet scars from famous gunfights, maybe? Before Wilson could respond, commotion erupted outside. Seth Wade burst into the office, his face flushed with anger and something closer to fear. "Luke, Tucker and Pete just rode in. You ain't gonna believe who the sheriff is." At Crystal Creek, Morgan was helping Emma and Sarah into the wagon, while Cooper and Bill Watson kept their rifles trained on the two captured observers. The other two watchers had melted away into the landscape, no doubt racing back to town with the news. "Take them to the Watson Ranch," Morgan instructed Cooper. "Keep them there until I send word." He turned to his wife, seeing the familiar worry in her eyes. "Emma, stay with Bill's family. Sarah will love playing with their girls." "Thomas," Emma's voice was barely a whisper. "It's starting again, isn't it?" Morgan touched her cheek gently. "Some men don't leave the past buried, darling, no matter how deep you dig the hole." He looked at his daughter, who was watching the scene with a mixture of excitement and confusion. "Sarah, remember what Papa told you about the bad men he used to chase?" Sarah nodded solemnly. "Before you met Mama, when you were Lightning Morgan." "That's right, sweetheart. Well, Papa needs to be Lightning Morgan again just for a little while." In town, Marcus Wade listened to Tucker's breathless report with growing rage. "Lightning Morgan," he spat the name like poison. "The same bastard who killed our brothers. Been right here under our noses playing family man." Seth paced the hotel room, his scarred face twisted with fury. "We should kill them all now. His woman, his kid, burn the whole damn town." "No." Marcus's voice cut through his brother's rage like a steel blade. "We do this right. Morgan took 4 of our brothers, made us run like rabbits across 3 territories. Now we're going to take everything from him, nice and slow." Luke entered the room, pushing Doc Wilson ahead of him. "Found this old buzzard in Morgan's office, Marcus, looking at wanted posters and old telegrams. Seems he knows something about our history with the good sheriff." Wilson stood straight despite his fear, years of treating the wounded and dying giving him a certain courage. "I was in El Paso," he said quietly. "Saw what Morgan did to the Mason brothers. 3 gunfighters against 1 lawman, and he put them all down before they could clear leather. I recognized your face, Marcus Wade. Saw you there that day too, watching from the shadows." Marcus smiled, but it was the smile of a wolf sizing up injured prey. "Then you know what's coming, Doc. You know exactly what kind of storm's about to hit your peaceful little town." "Morgan's not the same man he was," Wilson warned. "He's got something to lose now. That makes him more dangerous, not less." "No, Doc," Marcus replied, drawing his gun with practiced ease. "Having something to lose makes him vulnerable, and we're going to teach him exactly what that means." The sun was setting over Silver Creek, painting the sky in shades of blood red. Morgan rode toward town alone, his familiar weight of his ankle gun now joined by his old gun belt, retrieved from its hiding place in the wagon. With each hoofbeat, the peaceful sheriff of Silver Creek faded a little more, and Lightning Morgan, the deadliest lawman in 3 territories, emerged from 5 years of quiet slumber. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the trees around Crystal Creek as Thomas Morgan made a show of continuing to search for wild horses. But his movements had changed, becoming fluid and precise, each step carefully placed. Emma noticed the transformation from her spot by the picnic blanket. It was like watching a house cat turn into a mountain lion. Up on the ridge, 2 men lay hidden in the brush, rifles trained on the scene below. They weren't Wade gang members, just hired guns brought in to watch the sheriff and his family. But something about Morgan's movement made the older of the 2, a scarred man named Tucker, increasingly uneasy. "Don't like this, Pete," Tucker whispered to his companion. "Way he's moving. Reminds me of someone." "You're jumping at shadows," Pete replied, adjusting his grip on his rifle. "Boss said he's just some soft town sheriff." Down by the creek, Morgan had maneuvered so that Sarah and Emma were behind him, using his body to shield them from the ridge while appearing to examine tracks in the mud. "Emma," he called out, his voice carefully casual, "might want to start packing up. Storm's coming. Emma looked at the clear blue sky, then back at her husband. She recognized the code they'd established years ago, back when his gun had been famous from Texas to the territories. Storm coming meant trouble. She began quietly gathering their things, keeping her movements unhurried. In town, Doc Wilson had made his way to the sheriff's office, the old telegram clutched in his trembling hand. The office was empty, Deputy Cooper still out on his scouting mission. Moving to Morgan's desk, Doc began searching through the wanted posters, looking for confirmation of his suspicions about the Wade gang. Marcus Wade, watching from the saloon window, spotted the old doctor entering the sheriff's office. "Luke," he called to his brother. "Seems like the good doctor's taking an interest in law enforcement. Might want to see what he's up to." At Crystal Creek, Morgan had counted 4 men total, the 2 on the ridge, one in the trees to the west and another by the creek's bend. Just observers, he figured, meant to watch and report back. But something had spooked them. The man by the creek's bend had shifted position twice, hand straying closer to his gun each time. "Sarah, darling," Morgan called out, "remember that game we played last month? The one where you had to get to the wagon without being seen?" Sarah's eyes lit up, though she knew from her father's tone that this wasn't really a game. "Like hide and seek?" "Just like that. Why don't you and your mother play it now? Real quiet-like." Tucker, watching through his rifle scope, frowned as the sheriff's wife and daughter began moving carefully toward their wagon. Something about their movement suggested practice, not panic. "Pete," he whispered, "something ain't right. The woman and kid, they've done this before." Before Pete could respond, Morgan did something that made Tucker's blood run cold. He turned and looked directly at their hidden position, his eyes finding them through the brush, as if the concealment didn't exist. In that moment, Tucker recognized the look. He'd seen it 5 years ago on the face of the lawman who'd hunted down 4 of the Wade brothers. "Sweet Jesus," Tucker breathed, already scrambling backward. "It's him. He's lightning more." The crack of a twig behind them made both men spin. They found themselves staring at Deputy Cooper, his Winchester leveled at their heads. Bill Watson stood beside him, rifle equally ready. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Cooper said quietly. "Hands where we can see them." Down by the creek, Morgan watched the scene on the ridge unfold. Emma and Sarah were safely in the wagon now, and he allowed himself a small smile. Bill Watson had read the signs perfectly, exactly as Morgan had hoped when he sent Cooper to the old scout's ranch. The storm was indeed coming to Silver Creek, but not quite the way Marcus Wade had planned. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and Thomas Lightning Morgan was starting to remember just how much he enjoyed the chase. Crystal Creek lived up to its name that morning, its waters sparkling under the climbing sun. Thomas Morgan watched Sarah feeding breadcrumbs to the ducks, her laughter echoing across the water. Emma sat beside him on the checkered blanket, her head resting on his shoulder. The peaceful scene should have eased his mind, but the weight of his hidden gun, strapped to his ankle beneath his boot, felt heavier than usual. Back in town, Seth Wade had broken away from his brothers, making his way to the telegraph office. The operator, a young man named Patrick, looked up nervously as the scarred man entered. "Any messages come through for the sheriff today?" Seth asked, his voice deceptively casual as he leaned against the counter. Patrick swallowed hard. There was something about the man's eyes that made his skin crawl. "Can't discuss official communications, sir." "Sheriff's orders." Seth's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Course not. Man's just curious is all." He dropped a gold coin on the counter. "But if something important comes in, might be nice to know about it." In his hotel room, Marcus Wade was meeting with 2 new arrivals, hard-looking men who'd slipped into town through the back trails. "Town's perfect," he told them, spreading a crude map on the table. "Bank's got a big payroll coming in for the mine. Sheriff's out with his family. Time to set things in motion." Luke Wade, watching from the window, spotted Deputy Cooper riding out of town. "Jim's headed north," he reported, "just like you said he would." Marcus nodded, satisfied. "Sheriff's cautious, I'll give him that. Sending his deputy to scout the trails won't help him, though." He turned to one of the newcomers. "Follow him. Make sure he doesn't get back to town too quick." At Crystal Creek, Sarah had convinced her father to help her look for wild horses. They walked along the stream bank, Morgan pointing out fresh hoofprints in the mud. But his eyes kept scanning the tree line, and his ears strained for any sound that didn't belong. "Papa," Sarah asked suddenly, "why do you keep looking at the trees?" Morgan smiled down at his daughter, impressed by her observation. "Just watching for those horses, darling. They're shy creatures." Emma, who'd stayed behind with the picnic, saw the exchange and felt a familiar tightness in her chest. She'd been married to Thomas long enough to know when he was on edge. She remembered the early days of their marriage, before Sarah was born, when he'd worn his reputation openly, when men would cross the street to avoid meeting his eyes. In town, old Doc Wilson was sitting on his porch when he spotted Seth Wade leaving the telegraph office. Something about the man's bearing triggered ancient memories. He'd been in Dodge City years ago, when the Wade gang had terrorized the region, had seen what they'd done to the sheriff's family there. Moving with surprising speed for his age, Doc made his way to his back room. In a dusty chest lay a telegram he'd kept for 5 years, warning about a gang of killers heading toward his previous home in El Paso. The same day he'd watched a young Thomas Morgan take down the Mason brothers in a display of gunfighting that still haunted his dreams. Near the creek, Morgan suddenly stiffened. Sarah, intent on following horse tracks, didn't notice, but Emma did. "Thomas?" she asked softly. "Take Sarah back to the blanket," he said quietly, his voice carrying an edge she hadn't heard in years. "Stay there." As his family moved away, Morgan casually scanned the ridgeline above the creek. There, a glint of metal in the brush, quickly hidden. Someone was watching them. The peaceful day at Crystal Creek had just become something else entirely, and Thomas Morgan felt old instincts rising to the surface, like a snake uncoiling in the sun. Dawn broke over Silver Creek with the promise of heat, the kind of morning that made men's tempers short and their trigger fingers itchy. Marcus Wade sat in his hotel room, watching the street come to life through a grimy window. His younger brother Luke was cleaning his revolver with mechanical precision, while their middle brother Seth paced like a caged mountain cat. "Tell me again why we're waiting," Seth growled, his scarred face twisted with impatience. "Town's ripe for picking. Sheriff's soft as summer butter." Marcus turned from the window, his weathered face unchanging. "Because 5 years ago, someone put 4 of our brothers in the ground. Someone fast. Someone who knew what he was doing." He paused, letting the words sink in. "And I aim to make sure that someone isn't wearing a badge in this town before we make our move." Down on the street, Deputy Cooper was making his morning rounds, trying to shake off a growing sense of unease about the new arrivals. He'd sent a telegram to the Territorial Marshal's office the previous evening, asking about Marcus Wade and his brothers. The reply wouldn't come until afternoon at the earliest. At the sheriff's house, Thomas Morgan was helping Emma pack a picnic basket. They'd promised Sarah a day by Crystal Creek, a mile outside town. It was their Saturday tradition, one he'd kept religiously since taking the badge. As he watched his wife and daughter prepare, something tugged at the back of his mind, old instincts that had kept him alive through countless gunfights. "Maybe we should stay in town today," he suggested, trying to keep his voice casual. Emma looked up, her green eyes searching his face. She'd known him long enough to read the subtle tension in his shoulders. "Is something wrong, Thomas?" Before he could answer, Sarah bounded into the kitchen, her 7-year-old face bright with excitement. "You promised, Papa. You said we'd go see the wild horses today." The worry in his gut wrestled with the joy in his daughter's eyes. Finally, he smiled. "Of course we'll go, darling. Papa just needs to talk to Deputy Cooper first." He found Cooper outside the jail, looking troubled. "Something about these prospectors doesn't sit right, Sheriff," the young deputy said quietly. "The way they handle themselves, the questions they've been asking in the saloon." "I know," Morgan replied, his voice low. "I want you to ride out to the Watson Ranch today, Jim. Tell old Bill I need to borrow his eyes. Have him watch the north trail into town. If these men have friends waiting in the hills, Bill will spot them." Cooper nodded, understanding. Bill Watson had been a scout in the Indian Wars, and his ranch overlooked the main approach to Silver Creek. If anyone tried to slip into town, he'd know. In the saloon, Luke Wade was gathering information from Charlie, the chatty bartender. "Peaceful town you got here," he commented, sliding another whiskey across the bar. "Must be nice having a sheriff who keeps order without violence." Charlie beamed with pride. "Sheriff Morgan's 1 in a million. Why, just last month he talked down the Peterson boys when they were drunk and looking for trouble. Never even touched his gun." "Never?" Luke's eyes glittered with interest. "Well," Charlie lowered his voice conspiratorially, "there was that business with Jake Miller last year. Tried to rob the bank, he did. Sheriff just walked right in, calm as you please, and convinced him to give himself up." What Charlie didn't mention, because he didn't know, was that Jake Miller had been so terrified by the look in Morgan's eyes that he'd confessed to a priest afterward, saying he'd never seen such controlled deadliness in a man's gaze. As the morning wore on, Thomas Morgan led his family toward Crystal Creek, their wagon raising dust on the trail. From their hotel window, the Wade brothers watched them leave town, cruel smiles playing across their faces. The game was about to begin, but they were playing by rules they didn't understand, against a man whose real nature they had yet to discover.